A millionaire invited a street boy to a luxury party to humiliate him. Hours later, everyone was speechless when the boy called one of the guests Daddy. The crystal chandeliers cast a deceptive warmth over the opulent ballroom as 12-year-old Luke stood trembling on the narrow platform, 3 feet above the marble floor. His tattered clothes, hastily replaced with an ill-fitting suit, did little to disguise his street origins. Dozens of champagne flutes balanced precariously on the silver tray in his hands, their contents threatening to spill with each slight movement. 5,000 says he falls before reaching halfway. A man's voice cut through the expectant silence, followed by cruel laughter and the clink of betting money. 10,000 on him crying first, another added, causing ripples of amusement through the crowd of Manhattan's elite. William Matthews, their millionaire host, watched with calculated satisfaction. "Remember, boy," he called out, his voice dripping with false encouragement. "Cross the platform without spilling a drop, and the money is yours. Enough to eat for months, isn't it?" Luke's hands trembled as he took the first step. The platform swayed slightly, causing the glasses to clink ominously. He could feel the weight of dozens of camera phones recording his every move, waiting for his failure. His stomach churned with hunger and humiliation. Halfway across, someone deliberately bumped the platform's base. Luke froze, his heart pounding as the glasses wobbled dangerously. Cruel laughter echoed through the hall. Tears threatened to fall, but he refused to give them the satisfaction. His mother had always taught him that dignity was worth more than gold. "Just fall already," a woman in diamonds sneered. "We all know how this ends for street rats." But as Luke steadied himself, a different voice cut through the malicious murmurs deeper, filled with shock and recognition. "Stop this immediately," the commanding tone silenced the room. Through his tears, Luke saw a tall man pushing through the crowd, his face pale with fury and disbelief. "Luke," the man whispered, his voice breaking. "My God, my son." The champagne glasses rattled as Luke's whole body began to shake. He knew that voice. After 3 years on the streets, countless nights of hunger and despair, he would never forget that voice. "Dad," he whispered, his world tilting on its axis. The silence in the ballroom became deafening as father and son locked eyes across the glittering void, 3 years of separation crystallizing into this single devastating moment. In this gripping tale of dignity, redemption, and family bonds, every moment unfolds with raw emotion and unexpected twists. If this opening scene captured your heart, subscribe now to witness the extraordinary journey that lies ahead. Your support fuels our storytelling passion. 3 years earlier, 9-year-old Luke Anderson lived a life that seemed crafted from the pages of a perfect childhood story. The Andersons' brownstone in Upper East Side Manhattan echoed with laughter and piano music, where Luke would practice under his mother Sarah's patient guidance. His father, Michael, despite being one of New York's most successful real estate developers, always made time for morning pancakes and bedtime stories. Luke excelled at St. Bernard's Preparatory School, where his quick wit and kind heart made him popular among both teachers and classmates. Every Friday he would volunteer with his mother at the local homeless shelter, helping serve meals to those less fortunate. "Everyone deserves kindness," Sarah would tell him, "because you never know their story." These words would later haunt Luke during his darkest hours. The family's weekend traditions were sacred Saturday mornings meant baseball practice with Dad in Central Park, followed by hot chocolate at their favorite cafe. Sundays were for family movies and Sarah's famous pot roast, the aroma filling every corner of their home. Luke's room was a testament to his passions. Model airplanes hung from the ceiling, bookshelves overflowed with adventure stories, and a telescope by the window spoke of his dreams of becoming an astronomer. But beneath this idyllic surface, subtle cracks were forming. Michael's real estate empire was expanding rapidly, leading to increasingly frequent business trips. Sarah's piano studio was gaining recognition, bringing more students and longer hours. Luke spent more time with their housekeeper, Mrs. Martinez, who treated him like her own grandson but couldn't replace his parents' presence. Still, love permeated every aspect of Luke's life. His parents never missed a school performance or baseball game. Their refrigerator door was a gallery of his artwork and papers. Each night, no matter how late, either mom or dad would tuck him in with a kiss and their special saying, "Love you to the stars and back." The last perfect day came on Luke's 9th birthday. Michael cleared his schedule, Sarah cancelled all lessons, and they spent the entire day at the Natural History Museum, Luke's favorite place. They had dinner at his beloved Italian restaurant, where the staff sang happy birthday in Italian. His cake was decorated with stars and planets, and his parents gifted him the professional telescope he'd been dreaming of. That evening, as Luke gazed at his new telescope, Sarah played his favorite Chopin nocturne on the piano while Michael sat beside him, explaining the constellations. "You know, son," Michael said, "some stars seem to disappear sometimes, but they're always there, even when we can't see them. Just like our love for you, constant, eternal, unchanging." Luke fell asleep that night surrounded by love, security, and dreams of the future. He couldn't have known that within 24 hours, his world would shatter completely. He couldn't have imagined that the next time he'd see his father would be across a cruelly orchestrated party, or that his mother's piano would fall silent for years after his disappearance. The memory of that last perfect day would sustain Luke through countless nights on the streets, a beacon of warmth in the coldest times. Years later, he would realize that his father's words about constant love were prophetic. It was that unchanging parental love that would eventually bring them back together, though not before life had taught them all its harshest lessons about loss, privilege, and the true meaning of family. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Luke was rushing to catch the school bus, his backpack heavy with books, mind preoccupied with the upcoming science quiz. Sarah had an early student, so Mrs. Martinez packed his lunch peanut butter and jelly, his comfort food. Nobody could have predicted that this ordinary sandwich would be his last proper meal for weeks. The chaos began during lunch break. A fire alarm blared through the school halls, triggering an evacuation. In the ensuing panic and confusion, Luke got separated from his class. Instead of exiting through the main doors, he found himself pushed toward a side entrance he'd never used before. The autumn wind whipped around him as he emerged into an unfamiliar street, the crowd of students dispersing in different directions. Determined to find his way back, Luke walked what he thought was the right direction, but each turn led to increasingly unknown territory. New York's concrete maze, once so familiar, became a terrifying labyrinth. Hours passed. His phone's battery died. Darkness fell. Fear crept in, transforming the city he loved into a menacing stranger. That first night, Luke huddled in a cardboard box behind a grocery store, his school uniform offering little protection against the October chill. He could hear his parents' voices in his head, "Stay put when you're lost." But he had moved so far from where he started, he didn't know where put was anymore. Tears froze on his cheeks as sirens wailed in the distance. Dawn brought no relief. His expensive private school uniform now marked him as a target. An older street kid cornered him, demanding money. When Luke had none to give, the boy took his shoes instead. By sunset, his jacket was gone too, traded for a moldy sandwich and a worn hoodie that smelled of cigarettes. His feet, clad only in dress socks, were bleeding from walking on rough pavement. The desperate search for his family consumed his days. Luke wandered the streets calling out for his parents, but Manhattan's vastness swallowed his cries. He saw missing person posters with his face, but they were in areas he no longer recognized. Once he spotted his father's car in traffic, but his screams were drowned by honking horns. The car disappeared around a corner, taking hope with it. Survival instincts kicked in with brutal swiftness. Luke learned to seek warmth in subway stations, to find edible discards behind restaurants, to avoid the dangerous areas where desperate adults preyed on lost children. His private school education seemed worthless now, replaced by harder lessons which shelters were safe, which cops were kind, which alleys offered protection. The worst part wasn't the hunger, though it gnawed constantly at his stomach. It wasn't the cold, though it made him shake uncontrollably at night. The real torture was knowing his parents were somewhere in this same city, probably driving themselves mad with worry, while he slept in doorways mere miles from his bedroom telescope. One night, about 2 weeks after getting lost, Luke found an old newspaper. There on the front page was his story. The photo showed his parents at a press conference, his mother's face gaunt with grief, his father's eyes hollow with desperation. The headline read, "Developer Michael Anderson offers $1 million reward for missing son." Luke clutched the paper to his chest and sobbed until dawn, the cruel irony crushing him. He was simultaneously the most wanted and most invisible boy in New York. By the time a month had passed, Luke Anderson, the privileged son of Manhattan's elite, had vanished. In his place was just another street kid, harder, warier, but still clinging to memories of love and warmth like precious jewels in the darkness. His school uniform was long gone, his proper accent fading, his soft hands calloused from climbing fire escapes. Only his eyes remained unchanged, holding the same stars his father had once pointed out to him, now seeming as distant as home itself. 3 years after his disappearance, Luke Anderson had mastered the harsh curriculum of street survival. His once privileged existence felt like a distant dream, replaced by the daily struggle to secure life's most basic necessities. At 12, he was already an expert in the underground economy of New York's forgotten children. Though he never resorted to stealing, holding on to this last shred of his mother's teachings about dignity. His territory now was the grimy backstreets of Lower Manhattan, far from his family's Upper East Side world. Each morning began before dawn, when restaurant workers dumped yesterday's unsold food. Luke had mapped every dumpster worth checking, knowing which cafes threw away whole sandwiches and which bakeries discarded day-old pastries. He'd learned to ignore the shame that came with each dive into a garbage bin, focusing instead on the victory of finding unspoiled food. During the day, Luke earned small change helping delivery trucks unload or carrying groceries for elderly shoppers. He'd become known among the local shopkeepers as the honest street kid, the one who never stole and always worked hard. Some would save bruised fruit or damaged goods for him, pretending they couldn't sell them anyway. Mrs. Chen, who ran the corner store, would sometimes let him sweep her sidewalk for a hot cup of instant noodles. His home was an abandoned storage room above a defunct theater, accessed through a broken fire escape. Luke had made it as comfortable as possible with discarded cardboard for insulation and a salvaged sleeping bag. A cracked mirror served as his window to check for approaching danger, and a rusty pipe dripped enough water to drink and wash. His most precious possession was a worn photo of his family, carefully wrapped in plastic, hidden in a hole in the wall. Despite his circumstances, Luke maintained a rigorous self-imposed schedule. He would practice multiplication tables by counting passing cars, read discarded newspapers to keep his education alive, and make up science experiments with found objects. Sometimes he'd sneak into public library bathrooms to clean up and spend hours reading, losing himself in books that reminded him of his old life. The street had its own family system. Luke looked after younger kids, teaching them safe places to sleep and which adults to trust. He shared his food when he could, remembering his mother's words about kindness. The older teens protected him in return, warning him about dangerous areas and predatory adults. They called him Professor because he could still solve math problems and explain why the sky was blue. Winter was the cruelest season. Luke had learned to sleep in shifts during the coldest nights, moving constantly to stay warm. He knew every 24-hour diner that would let street kids huddle in corners on brutal nights, every steam grate that provided life-saving warmth. His hands bore chilblain scars from those first winters when he didn't know better. Yet through it all, Luke never completely lost hope of reuniting with his family. He kept track of his father's real estate developments through newspaper headlines, sometimes standing outside project sites just to feel a connection. Occasionally, he'd pass his old school during lunch break, watching his former classmates play in the yard, their lives continuing as if he'd never existed. The hardest moments came at night when the city quieted and memories flooded back: the sound of his mother's piano, the smell of his father's aftershave, Mrs. Martinez's warm hugs. In these moments, Luke would recite their old bedtime, saying "love you to the stars and back." It became his mantra, a reminder of who he was beneath the street-hardened exterior. What no one knew was that Luke had been slowly saving money, hiding coins and small bills in his secret wall cavity, not for food or clothes, but for a subway ticket uptown. Sometimes he'd stand at the station, watching trains head toward his old neighborhood, wondering if his next ride might finally lead him home. But fear always held him back: fear of rejection, fear of the changes 3 years had wrought, fear that the warm memories sustaining him might shatter against cold reality. William Matthews sat in his black Mercedes, watching the street scene before him with calculated interest. His recent party had bored him: the same faces, same conversations, same shallow entertainment. As one of Manhattan's most influential property developers, he craved something more, unique for his next social gathering. Something that would have his guests talking for months. Through the tinted windows, he observed the boy digging through a dumpster behind his favorite restaurant. There was something different about this one: a certain grace in his movements, an air of lost refinement that set him apart from other street children. Matthews leaned forward, intrigued, as the boy wiped his findings on a relatively clean rag before eating. Even in desperation, he maintained a peculiar dignity. "Parker," Matthews addressed his driver, "what do you make of that boy?" The chauffeur, accustomed to his employer's darker whims, studied Luke carefully. "There's a story there, sir. He doesn't carry himself like a typical street kid." Matthews smiled, an idea forming in his mind. Exactly. He's perfect. What Matthews didn't reveal was his deeper motivation. 3 weeks ago, he'd lost a major development deal to Michael Anderson, a defeat that had cost him millions and damaged his reputation. The humiliation still burned, made worse by Anderson's sanctimonious speech about ethical development at the shareholders' meeting. Now, watching this dignified street boy, Matthews saw an opportunity for the most exquisite form of entertainment, one that would also serve as a commentary on Anderson's hypocritical moralizing about caring for the community. Over the next few days, Matthews had his security team observe the boy. Their reports fascinated him. The kid helped elderly shoppers with their bags, shared food with younger children, and was even spotted reading discarded books. He never stole, never begged, maintaining a strange nobility despite his circumstances. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Matthews began planning his next party meticulously. He envisioned it as a social experiment, taking this street urchin, cleaning him up, and presenting him to high society, only to orchestrate his systematic humiliation. The betting pool alone would entertain his jaded guests, but the real pleasure would come from watching the boy's dignity crack under the weight of their collective cruelty. "I want everything documented," he instructed his event planner. "Multiple cameras. Every moment of discomfort, every flinch, every tear will make it an unforgettable spectacle." The planner, though uncomfortable, nodded. No one refused William Matthews. In his study that evening, Matthews refined his plan while sipping 30-year-old scotch. He'd start small, having the boy serve drinks, enduring snide comments and accidental spills, then escalate to more elaborate humiliations, perhaps a display of his table manners, or lack thereof. The grand finale would be some impossible task with money as bait, something to really break his spirit. What Matthews couldn't know was that fate was setting up its own elaborate joke. His perfect entertainment, this street boy with unusual refinement, was the very son of his bitter rival. The cosmic irony of his plan would only become apparent later, when it all spectacularly backfired. As he finalized the details, Matthews remembered his own childhood humiliations at an elite boarding school, where old money boys had tormented the scholarship student he'd been. He'd spent decades building his empire, determined to never feel that powerless again. Now, he would orchestrate the ultimate display of power, not just over one street boy, but over his entire social circle who would become unwitting participants in his cruel theater. "Parker," he called to his driver, "tomorrow we make our move. Follow the boy, learn his routine. When the moment is right, I'll make contact." His driver nodded silently, having long ago learned not to question his employer's darker impulses. Matthews stood at his penthouse window overlooking the city he'd helped build. Soon, he thought, his guests would have something to really talk about. A social experiment, an entertainment, a lesson in power dynamics, and for him, the sweetest revenge against all those who'd ever looked down on him. In the streets below, unaware of the elaborate trap being laid, Luke continued his daily struggle for survival, holding onto his dignity like a shield. The collision course between predator and prey was set, though neither could predict how dramatically their roles would reverse. The late autumn sun was setting when Matthews made his move. Luke was resting against a brick wall, sharing half a found sandwich with a stray cat, a scene so perfectly pathetic it almost made Matthews laugh. The Mercedes glided to a stop, its black exterior reflecting the fading daylight like liquid obsidian. Boy Matthews called softly, rolling down his window. "Come here." He kept his voice gentle, practiced, perfected through decades of business negotiations. Luke hesitated, street instinct screaming danger. The cat darted away, but Luke stood his ground, maintaining a safe distance from the car. "I've been watching you," Matthews continued, his tone carefully calibrated between concern and authority. "You're different from the other street children, aren't you?" "More." Refined, he noted how Luke stiffened at the observation, confirming his suspicions about the boy's background. "I have a proposition for you," Matthews said, producing a crisp $100 bill and holding it out. "Consider it a gesture of good faith." Luke's eyes fixed on the money, but he didn't move. Matthews smiled inwardly. The boy's restraint was impressive, making the eventual breaking even more appealing. "There's a party at my mansion this weekend. Important people, endless food, warmth." Matthews paused, watching hunger flicker across Luke's face. "I'm looking for someone special to help serve drinks. Someone with natural grace. Someone like you." Luke's voice, when he finally spoke, surprised Matthews with its clarity. "Why me, sir? There are employment agencies for servers." The question was intelligent, cautious. Matthews' smile widened, breaking this one would be deliciously challenging. "Because, my boy, you have something most professional servers lack: authenticity. My guests are tired of polished pretense. They crave reality." Matthews didn't mention that this reality would be carefully orchestrated for maximum entertainment value. "You'll be paid well," Matthews continued, noting Luke's torn clothes and protruding ribs. "Enough to eat properly for months. Plus, we'll provide appropriate attire for the evening." He held up another $100 bill. "This is just the beginning." Luke shifted uncomfortably, weighing survival against instinct. "I don't know, sir. My mother always said not to trust." He trailed off, pain flickering across his face at the mention of family. Matthews seized the opening. "Ah, you had a mother who cared enough to warn you. Interesting. Where is she now?" The cruel question hit its mark, Luke's eyes filled with tears he refused to shed. Matthews pressed harder, his voice dripping false sympathy. "Wouldn't she want you to have a chance at a better life? One evening of honest work could change everything." He pulled out his wallet, making sure Luke saw the thick stack of bills inside. "Think of it: warm food, clean clothes, a real bed for the night. And if you don't like it, you can leave any time. You'll be a guest, not a prisoner." The lie rolled smoothly off his tongue as he watched Luke's resistance crumbling. The boy's hands were trembling, whether from cold or desire for the money, Matthews couldn't tell. Perfect. When Luke's voice cracked. "When is the party?" Matthews suppressed his triumphant smile. "Saturday evening." My driver will pick you up right here at 6. He handed Luke the $200 bills. Get yourself something to eat in the meantime. Consider it an advance. As the Mercedes pulled away, Matthews watched in his rearview mirror as Luke stared at the money in his hands, looking lost and small against the darkening city backdrop. Parker, he addressed his driver, make sure he's followed. We don't want our entertainment disappearing before Saturday. What Matthews didn't see was Luke's face after the car disappeared. The boy stood motionless, tears finally falling, whispering to himself, "I'm sorry, Mom. I know you said never trust strangers, but I'm so tired of being hungry." In his mansion, Matthews began making calls, setting his plan in motion. The guest list would be carefully curated, the cruelest of his acquaintances, those who would most enjoy the spectacle he was arranging. The cameras would be discreet but omnipresent, capturing every moment of humiliation. He had no way of knowing that his perfect plan, his elaborate entertainment, would become the instrument of his own downfall, that this carefully chosen street boy would be the key to his undoing. For now, Matthews simply savored his anticipated triumph, while somewhere in the city, Luke clutched $200 and wrestled with the decision that would change both their lives forever. Luke spent that night in his makeshift shelter, staring at the $200 bills under the dim light filtering through the broken window. The money represented more than just food, it was possibility, hope, and danger all wrapped into one crisp package. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, "Trust your instincts, sweetheart. If something feels wrong, it probably is." Everything about Matthew's offer felt wrong. The way the man had watched him, the calculated kindness in his voice, the too perfect timing of his appearance, it all screamed trap. Luke had survived 3 years on the streets by being cautious, by reading people's intentions. Rich men in expensive cars didn't usually offer opportunities to street kids out of kindness. Yet the hunger was real. Luke's stomach cramped painfully, reminding him that he hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Winter was approaching, and his thin jacket wouldn't protect him from the bitter cold much longer. He'd been getting weaker, finding it harder to compete with other street kids for the best dumpster pickings. Maybe, he whispered to himself, maybe this one time, the risk is worth it. He thought of the promised warmth, the food, the possibility of sleeping in a real bed, even if just for one night. The memory of his old life rose, unbidden soft sheets, hot showers, the security of walls and locks. But deeper than physical comfort lay another temptation. The party would be filled with wealthy people, the kind who might be able to help him find his family. 3 years of searching had yielded nothing. Perhaps this was his chance to make connections, to find someone who knew his parents. Luke pulled out the worn family photo from its hiding place, studying the faces that haunted his dreams. His father's strong features, his mother's gentle smile, they seemed to be watching him, judging his decision. "What would you want me to do?" he asked the silent photograph. "Keep safe but hungry, or take a risk for something better?" The street had taught Luke harsh lessons about offers that seemed too good to be true. He'd seen other kids disappear after accepting rides from friendly strangers. Some returned changed, broken. Others never returned at all. But Matthews had given his address, his real name. He was known, traceable. Surely he wouldn't risk his reputation with anything truly sinister? Standing up, Luke paced his small space, arguing with himself. "It's just one night," he reasoned. "I can handle being a server. I've watched enough through restaurant windows to know how it's done. If things feel wrong, I'll leave." He promised I could leave. But even as he convinced himself, doubt crept in. Why would a millionaire choose a street kid to serve at an elegant party? Why not hire professionals? Matthew's words about authenticity rang hollow, hiding something darker beneath their surface. Luke thought of his father's business lessons during their weekend breakfasts. Always understand the other person's motivation, son. What do they gain from the deal? What did Matthews gain from this arrangement? The question nagged at him, refusing to provide a comfortable answer. As dawn approached, Luke made his decision. He would go, but on his terms. he spent $100 on a cheap prepaid phone, his emergency escape plan. The other 100 he split, hiding half in his regular spot and keeping half for food. He memorized the mansion's address and researched possible escape routes on a library computer. "I'll be smart about this," he promised himself. "No drinking anything they offer. Stay alert. Watch the exits." The first sign of real trouble, "I'm gone," he tried to ignore the voice in his head that whispered he might not recognize the trouble until it was too late. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Luke cleaned himself as best he could in public restrooms, practiced his posture, and watched YouTube videos about formal table service on the library computers. He even attempted to smooth out his street accent, trying to recall the proper pronunciation his mother had insisted upon. By Saturday evening, standing at the designated pickup point, Luke had almost convinced himself this could work. The hunger and cold had worn down his defenses, making the risk seem worthwhile. As the familiar black Mercedes approached, Luke took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "Just one night," he whispered his final reassurance. "What's the worst that could happen?" He had no way of knowing that this question would be answered in ways both better and worse than he could imagine, that this night would end the longest chapter of his life and begin an entirely new one. The Mercedes wound through increasingly affluent neighborhoods, each turn taking Luke further from his familiar territory. His heart pounded as wrought iron gates swung open to reveal Matthew's mansion, a limestone behemoth that made his old Upper East Side home look modest in comparison. Crystal chandeliers blazed through towering windows, their light spilling onto manicured lawns where uniformed staff hurried about with last-minute preparations. Impressed, Matthews asked, watching Luke's reflection in the rearview mirror. "Wait until you see inside." His smile didn't reach his eyes, a detail Luke noted but tried to ignore. The car stopped at the service entrance, where a stern-faced housekeeper waited. "Mrs. Reynolds will get you," presentable Matthews said, emphasizing the last word while eyeing Luke's attempt at cleanliness with barely concealed disdain. "Follow her instructions precisely." He strode away, leaving Luke with the housekeeper, who regarded him as one might view a particularly troublesome stain. "This way," Mrs. Reynolds commanded, leading Luke through a maze of service corridors. Her heels clicked against marble floors, echoing like tiny judgments. She stopped at a bathroom door. "Scrub everything, twice. Use the disinfectant soap. There's a uniform waiting. You have 15 minutes. The bathroom was larger than Luke's entire shelter. He caught his reflection in the gilt-edged mirror, a street urchin in a palace. The hot water was a luxury he'd almost forgotten, but he couldn't enjoy it. Mrs. Reynolds' voice came through the door every few minutes, counting down his remaining time. The uniform was a white dress shirt, black pants, and bow tie, all slightly too big, making him look even younger and more vulnerable. Mrs. Reynolds returned, yanking the tie straight with enough force to make him wince. "Remember, eyes down, speak only when spoken to, and don't touch anything unnecessarily. We don't want you leaving. Marks." She led him to the kitchen, where other servers were preparing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. They were all professionals, their movements practiced and elegant. They ignored Luke completely, except for one young woman who whispered, "Good luck, kid. You'll need it." Matthews appeared suddenly, now dressed in an impeccable tuxedo. "Ah, much better," he declared, circling Luke like a curator examining a controversial exhibit, "though we can't quite hide your background, can we?" He grabbed Luke's hands, displaying the calluses and scars to the kitchen staff. Still, it adds to the authenticity. The first guests were arriving. Through the kitchen door, Luke could hear the murmur of expensive voices, the tinkle of fine crystal, the soft strains of a string quartet. Matthews handed him a heavy silver tray loaded with champagne flutes. "Remember, boy, you're here to serve and entertain. Don't disappoint me." Luke stepped into the ballroom and immediately felt the weight of dozens of curious stares. The women in designer gowns and dripping diamonds, the men in custom tuxedos, they all paused their conversations to watch him. Their eyes reminded him of the predatory gazes he'd learned to avoid on the streets. "Is this the one, William, a woman?" asked Matthews, examining Luke through her lorgnette. "How?" "Fascinating. Where did you find him?" She reached out to touch his face, but Luke instinctively stepped back, causing the champagne to slosh dangerously. "Careful with the crystal, boy," Matthews warned, his tone sharp. "It's worth more than you are." Laughter rippled through the growing crowd. Luke felt his face burn but kept his expression neutral, remembering his mother's lessons about dignity. "Look how he tries to stand up straight," another guest commented. "Like he's playing dress up in civilized clothes." More laughter. "William, you've outdone yourself. This is better than the exotic animals you brought last year." Matthews smiled, pleased with the reaction. "The evening has barely begun. Wait until you see what else I have planned for our young." Guest. The way he said guest made Luke's stomach clench. He tried to move away to focus on serving, but Matthews caught his arm. "Where are you going, boy? My friends have so many questions about your fascinating life." The guests crowded closer, their curiosity turning predatory. Luke felt trapped, the heavy tray becoming a burden that anchored him to this nightmare. He hadn't expected this, hadn't understood that he wasn't here to serve at the party, but to be the entertainment. The next hour became a blur of cruel questions and calculated humiliation. Each guest seemed determined to outdo the others in their mockery of Luke's situation. They formed a grotesque game, calling him to their groups only to create situations where he would fail or be embarrassed. "Boy, do you know what vintage this champagne is?" a corpulent man in a crushed velvet smoking jacket demanded. Before Luke could answer, the man continued, "Of course not. I suppose you're more familiar with the vintage of dumpster findings, aren't you?" His companions tittered, raising their glasses in mock salute. A woman in a red sequined gown deliberately stuck out her foot as Luke passed, causing him to stumble. Crystal glasses crashed to the marble floor, the sound silencing the room momentarily. "Oh dear," she exclaimed with exaggerated concern. "I suppose proper footwork isn't taught in the gutters." Matthews materialized instantly. "Clean it up," he ordered, his voice hard. "Every drop, every shard. With your hands." Luke knelt on the floor, aware of phones recording his humiliation, hearing the whispers and laughs above him. The broken crystal bit into his palms, but he refused to show pain. "Look how he picks up the pieces," someone observed. "Like a trained monkey. William, you must tell us your secret for domesticating street rats." More laughter, more phones recording, more deliberate spills for him to clean. Between tasks, Luke overheard snippets of conversation about betting pools. They were wagering on him on when he would cry, when he would try to steal, when he would break down completely. The realization made him feel sick, but he straightened his spine, remembering his mother's words about maintaining dignity in the face of cruelty. An elderly businessman cornered him by the bar. "Tell us, boy, what's the going rate for a meal in your world?" "A soul. Your dignity," his companions roared with laughter. "Though I suppose you left dignity behind long ago, didn't you?" Luke's hands trembled as he served drinks, but his voice remained steady. "No, sir. Dignity isn't something you leave behind. It's something people try to take from you." The unexpected response caused a moment of uncomfortable silence before someone quickly changed the subject. A younger woman with cold eyes decided to make him her special project. She followed him around the room, asking increasingly personal questions. "Do you remember what it's like to sleep in a real bed? When was the last time you had a proper bath? Does your family miss you, or did they throw you away like garbage?" Each question was a knife, expertly wielded to cause maximum pain. Luke maintained his silence, but each word cut deeper, reopening wounds he'd thought had scarred over. The woman seemed to take his silence as a challenge, becoming more determined to break him. Matthews watched it all with satisfied eyes, occasionally directing servants to refill Luke's tray, ensuring he couldn't escape the floor. When Luke tried to take a brief break, Matthews intercepted him. Tired already? But the main entertainment hasn't even begun. Don't disappoint me, boy. Remember our agreement. The professional servers gave Luke a wide berth, as if his shame might be contagious. All except one elderly bartender who quietly slipped him a glass of water when no one was looking, his eyes conveying silent sympathy. As the evening wore on, the guests became more intoxicated and their cruelty more creative. They began making him perform tricks for tips, balancing multiple trays, serving while walking backward, reciting the wine list he'd never seen. Each failure was met with mockery and theatrical sighs of disappointment. Perhaps we should start a collection, a woman suggested, dangling $100 bill. See if we can buy back some of his lost refinement. She let the bill fall to the floor. Fetch, boy. Luke stared at the money, his face burning with humiliation. The room went quiet, waiting to see what he would do. His stomach growled, reminding him of why he'd come, but his mother's voice was louder in his head. Your dignity is priceless, sweetheart. Never let anyone put a price tag on it. He looked the woman in the eye and walked away, leaving the bill on the floor. The silence that followed was different, surprised, almost respectful. But Matthew's voice cut through it like a whip. Getting proud, are we? Don't forget your place, boy. The night is young, and we haven't even reached the main event. The string quartet fell silent as Matthews commanded everyone's attention. The guests gathered around a previously curtained area of the ballroom, where staff had assembled a narrow, elevated platform, 3 feet above the marble floor. Its surface gleamed treacherously under the chandelier light. Ladies and gentlemen, Matthews announced, his voice carrying the practiced charm of a circus ringmaster. Our young friend has shown us his resilience throughout the evening. But now, let's test the true extent of his street-learned skills. He gestured toward the platform. A simple challenge: cross this beam while carrying a full tray of champagne. Not a drop can be spilled. Luke's heart pounded as Matthews continued. The reward. $10,000 in cash. He held up a thick envelope. Enough to keep our little street performer fed for months. Of course, if he fails. Matthews smiled coldly. Well, that's when the real entertainment begins. The guests erupted in excited chatter, already pulling out wallets to place bets. Luke heard the amounts increasing: $5,000 on a fall, $10,000 on tears, $15,000 on a complete breakdown. His hands grew clammy as a waiter approached with a loaded tray, 15 crystal flutes of champagne, filled to the brim. Having second thoughts, Boy Matthews taunted. Perhaps the streets haven't taught you enough about taking risks. The challenge in his voice was clear: refuse, and prove yourself a coward in front of everyone. Luke studied the platform. One wrong step, one slight tremor, and he'd face not just humiliation but serious injury. The marble floor below offered no forgiveness. Yet the money, real, life-changing money, beckoned. With $10,000, he could rent a room, buy proper clothes, maybe even hire someone to help find his family. I'll do it, Luke said quietly, his voice steadier than his hands. Matthew's smile widened as he helped Luke onto the platform, his grip unnecessarily tight, leaving bruises. Remember, Boy Matthews whispered, the cameras are rolling. Make it good. The first step onto the platform nearly undid him. It swayed slightly under his weight, causing the champagne to ripple dangerously close to the rims. Luke froze, finding his balance, remembering how he used to walk the narrow ledge outside his shelter window. Slowly, carefully, he began to move forward. Each step was a negotiation between gravity and determination. The guests fell silent, all eyes fixed on his precarious progress. Only the soft clink of crystal and his measured breathing broke the tension. Halfway across, Luke heard a muffled laugh, followed by a deliberate bump against the platform's base. The beam shuddered. Champagne sloshed wildly in the glasses. Several guests gasped, phones raised to capture the anticipated disaster. But Luke didn't fall. Years of navigating treacherous fire escapes and icy ledges had taught him how to adjust, how to find balance in imbalance. He stabilized the tray through sheer will, not a drop spilled. "Remarkable," someone whispered. "The boy has talent." "Talent," another scoffed. "More like the cunning of a rat." 3/4 across, exhaustion began to set in. Luke's arms trembled from holding the heavy tray. Sweat trickled down his back, making his borrowed shirt cling uncomfortably. Just a few more steps. That's when he heard a voice that cut through the tension like a thunderbolt. "Stop this immediately." Luke's head snapped up, breaking his careful concentration. There, pushing through the crowd, was a face he'd seen every night in his dreams for 3 years. Older, more lined with worry, but unmistakable. "Dad," the word escaped as barely a whisper. Michael Anderson's voice shook with fury. "Luke, my God, my son." And the recognition in his father's eyes shattered Luke's carefully maintained composure. The tray wavered. Glasses clinked ominously. The crowd held its breath, but the anticipated crash never came. Instead, with a surge of strength he didn't know he possessed, Luke completed the crossing. He set the tray down carefully on the waiting table, every glass intact, not a single drop spilled. Then his legs gave out. Strong arms caught him before he hit the floor, his father's arms. The scent of the familiar aftershave overwhelmed him, and suddenly he was 9 years old again, safe, protected, loved. "I've got you," Michael whispered fiercely. "I've got you, son." The ballroom erupted in chaos. Matthew stood frozen, his elaborate entertainment transforming into something entirely unexpected. He had planned to break a street boy for his guests' amusement. Instead, he had orchestrated the reunion of Michael Anderson, his bitter rival, with his long-lost son. The silence in the ballroom shattered into a cacophony of whispers and exclamations. Luke remained in his father's protective embrace, his body trembling from exhaustion and emotion. Michael Anderson's presence seemed to fill the entire room, his fury radiating in almost visible waves as he surveyed the scene, the platform, the spilled champagne, the phone still recording. "What kind of people are you?" Michael's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "What kind of monsters find entertainment in a child suffering?" His arms tightened around Luke as someone in the crowd tried to approach with a camera. Matthew stepped forward, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Now, Michael, this is all a misunderstanding. We were merely providing the boy with an opportunity to." "An opportunity?" Michael's laugh was harsh. "I saw the recordings on your guests' phones. I saw what you did to my son." He turned to address the crowd directly. "Yes, my son. The boy you've spent the evening tormenting is Luke Anderson, who disappeared 3 years ago. The child whose face was on every news channel, whose story you all claimed touched your hearts." Luke felt his father's hand trembling against his shoulder. "While we searched every street, every shelter, while his mother cried herself to sleep every night, he was out there alone. And now I find him here, being treated like a circus animal for your entertainment." The guests began to shift uncomfortably, many trying to discreetly delete the videos from their phones. The woman who had dropped the $100 bill earlier attempted to slip away, but Michael's voice stopped her. "Leaving so soon, Mrs. Harrison? But weren't you the one who tried to make my son crawl for money? Please stay. I'd love to discuss this with your husband on the charity board." Luke watched in amazement as his father systematically addressed each person who had participated in his humiliation. The careful facades of sophistication crumbled as Michael named names, referenced business connections, and reminded them of their recorded actions. "Dad," Luke whispered, his voice hoarse from unshed tears. "It's okay. I'm used to." "No," Michael's voice broke. "Don't say you're used to it. You should never have had to get used to any of this." He pulled back slightly, examining Luke's face with anguished eyes. 3 years. My boy, my precious boy. What did they do to you?" Before Luke could respond, Matthews made another attempt to salvage the situation. "If I had known he was your son, Michael, naturally." Naturally, what? Michael cut him off. "You would have chosen a different child to abuse? Does that make it better?" He turned to Luke. "Did he pay you to be here?" Luke nodded slowly. $200, and he promised $10,000 if I could cross the platform without spilling. Michael's expression darkened further. "So you put my son's life at risk for your twisted entertainment." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his checkbook. "You want to talk money, William? Let's talk money." He wrote quickly, tore out the check, and held it up. $1 million, the same amount I offered as a reward 3 years ago. But this isn't for finding my son, it's for the privilege of not destroying you completely when I leave here tonight. The check trembled in Matthew's hand as he took it. Michael continued, his voice deadly quiet. "Tomorrow you'll read about a generous donation to the Children's Rights Foundation. You'll never mention this evening to anyone. Because if one word of what happened here gets out, if one video surfaces, if one person whispers about how you treated my son, I will dedicate every resource I have to your destruction." Throughout this exchange, Luke stood straighter, his father's presence giving him strength he thought he'd lost. He watched the guests who had mocked him now averting their eyes, shame replacing cruelty. The transformation was remarkable. These powerful people, cowed by something stronger than money, a father's love and righteous anger. "Just one more thing," Michael said, addressing the room. "Look at him. Look at my son." The guests reluctantly raised their eyes to Luke, who met their gazes steadily. "Despite everything, the streets, the hunger, your cruelty, he never lost his dignity. Remember that the next time you think your wealth makes you superior." As if on cue, the elderly bartender who had shown Luke kindness stepped forward, so he addressed Michael, "Your son. Through everything tonight, he never compromised his principles. He refused to steal, to beg, to sacrifice his dignity even when they tried to force him. You should be proud." Michael's eyes filled with tears. "I am proud. God, I am so proud." He turned to Luke. "Let's go home, son. Your mother, she's waiting. She never lost hope, never stopped believing we'd find you." As they walked toward the door, Luke paused and turned back to the silent crowd. His voice was quiet but clear. "Thank you for teaching me that true worth isn't found in crystal glasses or marble floors. It's found in how you treat others, especially those you think are beneath you." The words hung in the air as father and son left the mansion, leaving behind a room full of wealthy, powerful people who had never felt poorer or more powerless. As Luke and Michael made their way through the crowd, an elderly gentleman in a well-worn but impeccably maintained tuxedo stepped forward. "Doctor." James Thompson had watched the evening's events unfold with growing distress, his heart aching for the dignified young boy who reminded him so much of his own lost son. "Mr. Anderson," he called softly. "A moment, please." Michael tensed protectively, but Luke touched his father's arm. "It's okay, Dad. He was the only one who showed me kindness tonight." Dr. Thompson approached carefully, his lined face reflecting decades of witnessing both human cruelty and resilience. "I should have stopped it sooner," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "But I recognize something in your son that I needed to confirm." He turned to Luke. "You don't remember me, do you?" Luke studied the older man's face, trying to connect it to memories from his past life. Dr. Thompson smiled gently. "I was your mother's psychiatrist after you disappeared. For 3 years I've listened to her speak about her lost boy, his intelligence, his kindness, his unbreakable spirit. Tonight I saw everything she described." Michael's expression softened with recognition. "Dr. Thompson?" "Sarah's Dr. Thompson." The elderly doctor nodded. "I've spent 3 years helping your wife hold on to hope. I knew if Luke was out there, he would have maintained the strength of character she described. Tonight proved she was right." The doctor reached into his pocket and withdrew a small notebook. "I've kept notes of every session with Sarah. She would describe her memories of Luke in such detail, how he would share his lunch with hungry classmates, how he never let bullies break his spirit, how he maintained his dignity even when life was unfair. Luke's eyes filled with tears as Dr. Thompson continued. "When I saw you tonight, maintaining that same dignity despite their cruelty, I knew you were her son. The way you held yourself, your quiet strength, it was exactly as she described, but I needed to be certain before I acted. You were studying me," Luke realized. "That's why you kept watching." "Yes," Dr. Thompson admitted, "I've learned in my profession that timing can be everything. I was about to intervene when your father arrived." He turned to Michael. "Your wife never gave up. Even when others suggested she accept the loss, she insisted Luke would find his way back." The doctor's voice grew softer. "She would tell me, my son has his father's determination and my heart. Wherever he is, he's fighting to come home, and she was right. You never stopped fighting, did you, Luke?" Luke shook his head, unable to speak. Dr. Thompson placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Every week your mother would bring a new photo to our sessions, telling me stories about the boy in them. Look," she would say, "look at how he carries himself. That's how I know he's surviving wherever he is." The elderly doctor's eyes grew distant with memory. "I lost my own son when he was about your age, Luke. Different circumstances, but the pain of a lost child, it's universal. Watching you tonight maintaining your dignity despite everything, it gave me hope that somewhere my David did the same." Michael wrapped an arm around Luke, who was now quietly crying. Dr. Thompson continued, his voice gentle but firm. "What these people fail to understand tonight is that dignity isn't given by wealth or taken by poverty. It's an internal flame that burns brightest in the darkest moments. You proved that, Luke." From his pocket, the doctor produced a small silver compass. "Your mother brought this to a session once. She said you'd left it on your bedside table the morning you disappeared. She felt it was a sign you'd find your way back." He held it out to Luke. "I've kept it safe, waiting for this moment." Luke took the compass with trembling hands, remembering how his father had given it to him on his 9th birthday. "A Anderson always finds his way home," Michael had said. The memory broke something inside him, and he began to sob in earnest. Dr. Thompson stepped back, addressing Michael. "Take him home to Sarah, but know that the healing process will take time. 3 years of street survival leaves scars that aren't visible. When you're ready, my door is always open." "Thank you," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for tonight, but for helping Sarah hold on to hope. For believing in our son when the world had given up." The elderly doctor smiled sadly. "In my profession, we see the darkest sides of humanity, but occasionally we're blessed to witness moments of extraordinary courage and grace. Your son showed both tonight. Never let him forget that." As they turned to leave, Dr. Thompson spoke one final time. Luke the boy looked back. "Your mother would often say that stars shine brightest against the darkest sky. Tonight you proved her right. Go home and show her that her faith was justified." They walked away, leaving Dr. Thompson watching their retreating figures. In his long career he had witnessed countless tragedies and triumphs, but few had moved him as deeply as this reunion. He thought of his own lost son, hoping that somewhere, somehow he had faced his final moments with the same dignity he'd witnessed in Luke tonight. The elderly doctor turned back to the ballroom, where the guests still stood in uncomfortable silence. His quiet voice carried clearly as he addressed them. "Remember this night. Remember how wealth and power crumbled before the simple dignity of a child. Perhaps then something good can come from this cruelty." In the wake of Dr. Thompson's departure, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted dramatically. The guests, their entertainment disrupted, began to fragment into small groups, their whispered conversations a mix of defensive justification and growing unease. Matthew stood alone by the platform, the $1 million check crumpled in his trembling hand, his carefully orchestrated evening unraveling spectacularly. "We couldn't have known a woman in diamonds," insisted to her circle. "How were we supposed to know he was Michael Anderson's son?" Her voice carried an edge of panic. Besides, the boy seemed resilient. We weren't really hurting him. Weren't we? The elderly bartender who had shown Luke kindness spoke up, his quiet voice cutting through their rationalizations. I watched that child's face every time you laughed at his expense. I saw the wounds your words inflicted. You knew exactly what you were doing. A prominent banker puffed up defensively. Now see here, we were merely participating in William's entertainment. If anyone's to blame, he gestured toward Matthews, who had begun pacing frantically near the platform. Oh yes, blame William, the bartender continued, removing his bow tie. But who placed bets on a child's tears? Who tried to make him crawl for money? Who recorded his humiliation for their amusement? He looked each guest in the eye. I've served at these parties for 30 years. I've seen decadence, excess, even occasional cruelty. But tonight you crossed a line you can't uncross. The tension in the room ratcheted higher as smartphones began buzzing with news alerts. Someone had leaked. The story was breaking: missing Anderson heir found at society party. Photos were already circulating online, showing Luke on the platform, his face a mask of determination amid obvious distress. My God, a society matron whispered, staring at her phone. The comments. They're calling us monsters, she looked up, face pale. My daughter's charity foundation. The board will see this. The panic spread as more guests checked their phones. Their carefully curated public images were crumbling in real time. Years of philanthropic work and social positioning threatened by one evening's entertainment gone horribly wrong. Matthews finally snapped. Enough, he shouted. This was supposed to be perfect. My revenge on Anderson wrapped in an evening's entertainment. How dare that street rat turn out to be his son? His mask of sophistication had completely slipped, revealing the bitter core beneath. Revenge, a guest asked, horrified. You knew who he was? Of course not, Matthews snarled. If I'd known, I would have. He stopped, realizing too late what he was revealing. The room fell silent as his words sank in. He had just admitted that only the boy's identity had troubled him, not the cruelty itself. Dr. Thompson, who had remained quietly observing, spoke again. And there it is. The truth behind the evening's entertainment: you didn't care about hurting a child. You only cared that you hurt the wrong one. The crowd began to disperse rapidly, no one wanting to be associated with the unfolding scandal. Phones were already ringing with calls from publicists and lawyers. Tomorrow, many would issue carefully worded statements about regrettable misunderstandings and make large donations to children's charities. As the last guest fled, Matthews stood in his empty ballroom, surrounded by the evidence of his cruel spectacle: the platform, the spilled champagne, the discarded betting slips. Dr. Thompson approached him one final time. You know what the true tragedy is, William? That boy showed more nobility in his suffering than this entire room demonstrated in their privilege. He maintained his dignity while you all lost yours. The staff began cleaning up, their movements efficient and purposeful, pretending not to hear their employer's broken sobs. The elderly bartender carefully collected Luke's serving tray, noting the fingerprints still visible on its silver surface, a child's last desperate grip on his pride. Outside, reporters were already gathering at the gates. Tomorrow's headlines would be merciless society's shame: lost boy tormented for entertainment, careers would end, reputations would crumble. But somewhere in the city, a family was reuniting, proving that even in the darkest moments, light could break through. The last person to leave was a young server who had witnessed everything. She paused at the door, looking back at the destroyed ballroom. You know, she said to no one in particular, that kid did something incredible tonight. He showed us that true class has nothing to do with money. As dawn approached, the mansion stood silent, its grandeur somehow diminished by the night's events. The morning light would illuminate an empty ballroom where society's masks had slipped, revealing the ugly truth beneath the glittering surface. But it would also shine on a family made whole again, proving that dignity, once firmly rooted, could survive even the cruelest storms. As Michael and Luke left Matthew's mansion, the night's full horror was only beginning to unfold. Reporters swarmed the gates, their camera flashes creating a strobe effect in the darkness. Michael shielded Luke with his jacket, guiding him toward their waiting car, but Matthew's voice cut through the chaos. Wait, the millionaire stumbled down the mansion steps, his composure completely shattered. You can't leave yet. The evening's entertainment isn't finished. His voice carried the desperate edge of a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble. Michael turned, positioning himself between Matthews and Luke. Haven't you done enough damage tonight, William? But Matthews wasn't finished. In a final, devastating act of malice, he pulled out his phone. Look, Anderson. Look what I've been saving for the grand finale. He held up the screen, showing a video that made both father and son freeze in horror. It was footage of 9-year-old Luke, taken the day he disappeared. The video showed him walking away from his school during the fire alarm, following someone whose face was just out of frame, someone who seemed to be leading him deliberately away from safety. You see Matthew's voice dripped with bitter triumph. Your precious boy didn't just get lost, he was led astray. And I know exactly who did it. Luke's grip on his father's arm tightened. Dad, his voice trembled. I don't remember. Why don't I remember? Michael's face had gone deadly pale. What do you want, William? Matthew smiled, though it looked more like a grimace. Simple. A trade. Your entire Anderson development project, the one you stole from me 3 years ago for the name of the person who took your son. Surely your boy's peace of mind is worth a few $1 billion. The gathered reporters had fallen silent, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Luke looked between his father and Matthews, seeing the years of rivalry and hatred that had somehow led to this moment. You're lying, Michael said, but uncertainty tinged his voice. You couldn't have known. Couldn't I? Matthews laughed harshly. Who do you think arranged the fire alarm? Who made sure little Luke would be separated from his class? It was all so perfectly planned until the incompetent fool I hired lost track of the boy in the confusion. Luke felt his knees buckle as memories began to surface. A stranger's voice, a promised shortcut back to his classroom, then confusion and fear as he found himself in unknown streets. You did this to me, because of a business deal. Matthew's face twisted. Your father ruined me. That development project was mine. I spent years planning it, and he swooped in with his ethical development nonsense and took everything. I bid fairly for that project. Michael's voice shook with rage. You lost because your plan involved displacing hundreds of low-income families. The city council chose my proposal because it preserved existing communities while creating new opportunities. And look what it cost you. Matthews gestured wildly at Luke. 3 years. 3 years your son spent on the streets because you chose strangers over success. Luke stepped forward, his voice stronger than anyone expected. No, I spent 3 years on the streets because you chose revenge over humanity, the same way you chose cruelty over kindness tonight. The reporters' cameras clicked frantically, capturing every moment. Matthews seemed to deflate, suddenly aware of what he had just confessed in front of witnesses. His phone slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering on the marble steps. Michael picked up the phone, his hands steady despite his fury. Thank you, William. That confession, recorded by all these lovely journalists, will ensure you spend a very long time thinking about your choices. He turned to the reporters. I trust you all got that. How William Matthews just admitted to orchestrating my son's kidnapping 3 years ago. And the night erupted into chaos. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Matthews collapsed on the steps, all pretense of sophistication gone. But Luke wasn't watching any of it. Instead, he was looking at his father, seeing the tears streaming down his face. Dad, can we go home now? Mom's waiting. Michael pulled his son close, his voice choked with emotion. Yes, son, let's go home. And this time I'm never letting you out of my sight again. As they drove away, Leaving Matthews to face the consequences of his actions, Luke finally asked the question that had burned in his mind all night. "Dad? How did you know to come to the party?" Michael smiled through his tears. "Dr. Thompson. He recognized you and called me immediately. He's been helping your mother hold on to hope all these years. I guess he helped give us back to each other too." The city lights blurred past their window as they headed home, each lost in thoughts of what had been lost and found this extraordinary night. During the drive home, Michael kept glancing at Luke through the rearview mirror, as if afraid his son might vanish again. Each street light illuminated the boy's face, revealing changes that 3 years had carved: the loss of baby fat, the watchful eyes, the way he unconsciously positioned himself near the door, ready to flee if necessary. "I saw you, Michael finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "So many times during those 3 years. Or I thought I did. Every dark-haired boy on every street corner. I'd slam on the brakes, jump out of the car, chase down some stranger's child." He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Your mother said I was torturing myself, but I couldn't stop looking." Luke shifted in his seat, memories surfacing. "I saw you too. Once, about a year ago, you were giving a speech at a homeless shelter opening. I was in line for food, but I hid when you started walking through the crowd. I was." He hesitated. "I was ashamed. I didn't want you to see what I'd become." The car swerved slightly as Michael fought to control his emotions. "Ashamed? Oh, Luke, you survived. You kept your dignity, your kindness, your spirit intact. Do you know how extraordinary that is? How proud I am of you." They stopped at a red light, and Michael turned to fully face his son. "Tonight, watching you on that platform, I've never been more terrified or more amazed in my life. You showed more courage and grace than any of those so-called elite people in their fancy clothes." Luke met his father's eyes, seeing the pain and pride warring there. "I remembered what you taught me about balance," he said softly. "Not just physical balance, but emotional too. And Anderson never loses his center, you used to say." Michael's breath caught. "You remembered that? After everything?" "I remembered everything, Dad. Every morning pancake, every baseball game, every bedtime story. Those memories. They kept me going. Kept me from becoming what they thought I was, just another street kid with no past and no future." The light turned green, but Michael didn't move. Cars honked behind them, but father and son remained locked in this moment of recognition. "When did you get so wise?" Michael asked, his voice cracking. "The streets teach you things," Luke replied, "like how to read people. That's how I knew Matthews was lying about the reward money. His eyes, they were like some of the predators I learned to avoid. But I still went because..." He paused, struggling with the admission. "Because what, son?" "Because I was tired of being alone. Even if it was a trap, even if it was just for one night, I wanted to pretend I belonged somewhere again." Michael pulled the car over, unable to drive through his tears. "You always belonged with us. Every holiday, every birthday, we set a place for you at the table. Your mother kept buying you Christmas presents, keeping them wrapped in your room. He'll want to open them when he comes home," she'd say. Everyone thought she was losing her mind. But she never stopped believing. Luke reached out hesitantly and touched his father's shoulder, the first contact he had initiated. "How? How did you know it was me? At the party? I look so different now." Michael turned, catching his son's hand in his. "Your eyes, they're still your mother's eyes. But it was more than that. It was the way you held yourself, refusing to break under their cruelty. That quiet strength, that's all you, son. That's always been you." The city hummed around their parked car, but inside time seemed suspended as 3 years of loss and longing crystallized into this moment of recognition. "When you were little," Michael continued, "you used to say you wanted to help people when you grew up. Tonight, I watched you share your water with a younger server when you thought no one was looking. 3 years on the streets, and you still think of others first. That's how I knew, beyond any doubt, that you were my Luke." Luke's composure finally cracked. "I tried so hard to make you proud, even when I thought I'd never see you again. Every time I wanted to steal food or take the easy way out, I'd hear your voice and Anderson's word is his bond." Michael pulled his son into an awkward embrace across the car seats. "I am proud. God, I am so proud it hurts. But Luke, you didn't have to earn our love. You never had to prove yourself worthy of being our son. We loved you every second of every day you were gone." As they held each other, both crying now, a police car pulled up alongside them. The officer approached, concerned about the parked vehicle, but stopped short when he recognized Michael Anderson. More importantly, he recognized Luke from the thousands of missing person posters that had papered the city for 3 years. "Mr. Anderson," the officer called softly. Is that really him?" Michael nodded, unable to speak. The officer smiled, tears in his own eyes. "I'll call it in, sir. Every cop in this city has been looking for your boy. They'll want to know he's safe." As the officer returned to his car, Luke looked at his father. "Everyone was looking for me." "Everyone," Michael confirmed. "And now we're almost home. Your mother. She's going to know the moment she sees you. She never lost faith. Not for a single day." They pulled back onto the street, both quieter now, but with hands still clasped, neither willing to break this newfound connection. The city that had kept them apart for so long was now leading them home together. The news of Luke's identity spread through Manhattan's elite circles like wildfire. Within hours, the video footage from Matthew's party had gone viral, showing the city's wealthiest citizens tormenting a lost child for entertainment. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Michael Anderson's office was flooded with calls from party guests desperate to explain, apologize, or bargain their way out of the public relations nightmare. His secretary had strict instructions: no calls would be accepted, no explanations entertained. The time for apologies had passed. The morning papers were merciless. High Society's new lost boy tormented for entertainment screamed the New York Times headline. The Post was more direct: monsters in mansion's elite mock homeless child. Beneath each headline were photos of the guests, their faces caught in expressions of cruel amusement as they watched Luke struggle on the platform. At the Four Seasons, where many of the city's power brokers traditionally met for breakfast, the usual crowd was notably absent. Those who did appear found their regular tables suddenly reserved. The maitre d', whose son had once been helped by the Anderson Foundation, took particular pleasure in turning away the party guests. Mrs. Harrison, who had tried to make Luke crawl for money, discovered her charity board had called an emergency meeting. By noon, she was forced to resign. Her husband's investment firm lost 3 major clients before lunch. The couple's social calendar, once filled months in advance, developed mysterious gaps as dinner invitations were rescinded. The woman in the red sequined gown who had deliberately tripped Luke found her fashion line dropped by major retailers. Her Instagram followers plummeted as the video of her cruelty circulated. No amount of publicist-crafted apologies could erase the image of her smirking as a child fell. But the real confrontation came at the emergency board meeting of the city's philanthropic council. Michael Anderson, as the largest private donor to the city's children's charities, had called the meeting. Every guest from Matthew's party who sat on a charity board was required to attend. They filed into the boardroom like chastened schoolchildren, their designer outfits and expensive jewelry unable to mask their discomfort. Michael stood at the head of the table, Luke's childhood photo projected on the wall behind him. "Look at this picture," he began, his voice deadly quiet. "This is my son at 9 years old, the age he was when Matthew's scheme separated him from us. For 3 years, he struggled to survive on the same streets where you park your luxury cars." He clicked to the next image: Luke on the platform at Matthew's party. "And this is what you did to him when he crossed your path. You who sit on children's charity boards. You who pose for photos at fundraisers. You who claim to care about the less fortunate. One board member tried to interrupt. Michael, we had no idea that he was my son. Michael's voice cracked like a whip. And that makes it better. Would it have been acceptable to humiliate him if he were just another homeless child? Is that the moral standard we're defending here? He placed his hands on the table, leaning forward. Every person in this room has received millions in tax benefits from their charitable giving. Today you'll all resign from your board positions. You'll donate those tax savings to actual street children's programs, and you'll do it quietly, without publicity. You can't force us, someone began. Can't I? Michael smiled grimly. The videos are very clear. The public is very angry. Your reputations, your social positions, your business relationships all hang by a thread. I'm offering you a chance to do one decent thing after your disgusting display of inhumanity. The room erupted in protests, but Michael held up his hand. My son spent 3 years surviving your world, the world of street children you claim to care about but actually despise. He maintained more dignity in his suffering than you showed in your privilege. So yes, I can force you, and I will. One by one, they signed their resignations. Each wrote checks that would significantly impact their luxurious lifestyles. They filed out of the boardroom, humbled and diminished, their social armor finally pierced by the reality of their actions. The last to leave was the woman who had recorded Luke's humiliation on her phone. At the door, she turned back. For what it's worth, I'm truly sorry. Michael looked at her steadily. It's not worth much. But you know who might value your apology? The children in the shelters where your money will now go. Go volunteer there. Look them in the eyes. Learn their names. See their humanity. Then maybe your apology will mean something. After they left, Michael sat heavily in his chair, emotionally drained. His phone buzzed a text from Luke. Dad, Mom wants to know if you're coming home for dinner. She's making my favorite. Michael smiled, his heart lifting. Tomorrow there would be more battles to fight, more wrongs to right. But tonight his son was home, his wife was cooking, and their family was whole again. Some of Manhattan's elite might have lost their social standing, but Michael Anderson had regained something far more precious: his faith in justice and his boy's trust in the goodness that could survive even the darkest experiences. The full scope of William Matthews' revenge plot emerged during his arraignment, sending shockwaves through New York's business community. The prosecution presented evidence that stretched back far beyond the cruel party emails, surveillance footage, and financial records that painted a picture of obsession spanning years. Detective Sarah Martinez, who had investigated Luke's original disappearance, stood before the press outside the courthouse. What we've uncovered is disturbing, she announced. Matthews didn't just orchestrate a kidnapping. He engineered an elaborate scheme designed to destroy the entire Anderson family. The evidence revealed that Matthews had first targeted the Andersons 3 years ago after losing the Wellington Heights development project to Michael. The project, worth billions, would have displaced hundreds of low-income families. Michael's alternative proposal, which preserved existing communities while still ensuring profitable development, had won unanimous approval from the city council. Matthews saw it as more than a business loss, Detective Martinez explained. According to his private correspondence, he viewed it as Anderson betraying their social class. He wrote, and I quote, "Michael forgot where he came from. He chose those street rats over his own kind. Let's see how he likes it when his own son becomes one of them." The kidnapping plan had been meticulous. Matthews had hired someone to pull the school's fire alarm, ensuring chaos. Another accomplice, posing as a teacher, was supposed to lead Luke to a waiting car. But the boy had panicked and run, disappearing into the city before Matthews' men could grab him. What's truly chilling, the detective continued, is that Matthews never stopped watching. His surveillance team spotted Luke multiple times over the years, but instead of reporting it, he documented the boy's descent into street life. He was building up to something bigger. The party, it turned out, was meant to be just the beginning. Police found detailed plans in Matthew's home office strategies to systematically destroy the Andersons' reputation, business, and family. The final phase would have revealed Luke's identity in the most damaging way possible, suggesting the Andersons had abandoned their son. Michael Anderson sat in the courtroom, listening as the prosecutor detailed how Matthews had tracked his son's movements, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sarah Anderson gripped her husband's hand, her face pale but composed as she heard how close they'd come to never finding Luke at all. The party wasn't just entertainment for Matthews, the prosecutor explained to the jury. It was a dress rehearsal. He wanted to break the boy's spirit completely before revealing his identity. The ultimate revenge, returning the Andersons' son as a broken shell of himself. What Matthews hadn't counted on was Luke's resilience, Dr. Thompson's recognition, or Michael's timely arrival. His carefully constructed plan had collapsed in a single evening, exposed by the very cruelty it was built upon. As the evidence mounted, Matthews sat slumped in his defendant's chair, his arrogance finally shattered. His own words condemned him, journal entries revealing his growing obsession, his bitter rants against Michael's betrayal of his class, his detailed observations of Luke's struggles on the street. One journal entry particularly stunned the courtroom. Watch the Anderson boy today. He's still maintaining that ridiculous dignity his father preached about. 3 years on the streets should have broken him. No matter. The party will finish what the streets couldn't. I'll show Michael what his precious ethics cost him. Luke, who had insisted on attending the hearing, listened with a calmness that surprised everyone. When asked how he felt about the revelations, his response reflected a maturity beyond his years. Mr. Matthews thought he could break me by making me live on the streets. Instead, he taught me the true meaning of strength. The people he looked down on, the homeless, the struggling. They showed me more humanity than his wealthy friends ever did. The judge, reviewing the evidence, noted that Matthew's obsession had ultimately cost him everything he valued: his reputation, his freedom, and his place in the society he had tried so desperately to protect. The man who had sought to destroy the Andersons had instead destroyed himself. As Matthews was led away in handcuffs, Michael hugged his son close. He never understood, Michael whispered. True wealth isn't in what you have, but in who you are. You proved that every day you survived, son. The morning after Luke's return, Sarah Anderson sat at her piano for the first time in 3 years. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly as she listened to her son's steady breathing from the next room. The instrument had stood silent since Luke's disappearance, its polished surface gathering dust like the fragments of her broken heart. Dr. Thompson's case notes painted a devastating picture of those 3 years. The first entry read, "Patient appears catatonic. Hasn't spoken since her son's disappearance. Husband reports she sits at the window for hours, watching the street." Sarah had spent those early weeks in a fog of medication and grief, unable to process the reality of her empty house. The piano had been their special connection. Every afternoon, Luke would rush home from school for his lesson, not because he loved playing, but because he loved sitting beside his mother on the bench, sharing those precious moments. After he vanished, the sight of the piano became unbearable. Michael had suggested moving it, but Sarah wouldn't allow it. "He'll want to practice when he comes home," she'd insisted. Their home became a shrine to absence. Luke's room remained exactly as he'd left it, that morning, bed unmade, astronomy books scattered on the floor, telescope pointed at the sky. Sarah would stand in the doorway for hours, breathing in the fading scent of her son. The cleaning lady was forbidden to touch anything, even to dust. Dr. Thompson's notes continued. Patient insists on maintaining all routines as if son was still present. Sets his place at dinner. Buys his favorite cereals, behavior concerning but somehow anchoring. She's created a ritual of remembrance that keeps her functioning. The worst moments came at night. Sarah would wake in panic, convinced she'd heard Luke calling for her. She'd run through the house, checking every room, every closet, until Michael found her sobbing in their son's empty bed. Sleep became her enemy, bringing dreams of Luke lost, crying, hungry. Her music students gradually drifted away. The woman who had once been Manhattan's most sought-after piano teacher couldn't focus long enough to complete a lesson. Parents would find her staring out the window, tears rolling silently down her face, lost in memories of another child at another lesson. Patient shows signs of profound depression, Dr. Thompson wrote, yet refuses to accept possibility of loss. Unique case, her denial doesn't prevent function but seems to enable it. She's created a parallel reality where her son's return is inevitable, allowing her to maintain hope while processing grief. Sarah maintained Luke's social calendar with fierce determination. She renewed his library card every year, paid his school tuition, kept his medical insurance active. Because he'll need these things when he comes home, she'd explain to concerned friends who suggested it was time to move on. The annual markers were the hardest birthdays, holidays, the anniversary of his disappearance. Sarah would bake Luke's favorite chocolate cake, wrap presents, write cards. Each year's gifts joined the growing collection in his room, waiting for his return. Michael worried about her sanity, but Dr. Thompson saw something else, a mother's indomitable hope keeping her alive. The patient demonstrates remarkable resilience through ritual, he noted. While others see denial, I see a sophisticated coping mechanism. She's created a framework where hope doesn't preclude functioning. Uncommon, but in her case possibly essential for survival. The turning point came 2 years in, when Sarah started volunteering at homeless shelters. She couldn't search the streets herself, the anxiety was too overwhelming, but she could help other lost children, hoping someone somewhere was doing the same for Luke. She would play piano at the shelters, watching every dark-haired boy who came through the doors, her heart stopping each time. Now, sitting at her piano the morning after Luke's return, Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of those 3 years. Her fingers found the keys, and Chopin's Nocturne, Luke's favorite piece, filled the house for the first time since his disappearance. Luke appeared in the doorway, drawn by the familiar melody. Sarah's hands faltered on the keys as she saw him, still hardly daring to believe he was real. "Mom," he said softly, "I missed your playing." Sarah patted the space beside her on the bench, their old signal. As Luke sat next to her, fitting perfectly in the spot that had stayed empty for 3 years, she realized that sometimes the most impossible hopes come true. Her fingers found the keys again, and mother and son began to play together, healing their hearts one note at a time. The scale of the Andersons' search for Luke became legendary among New York's law enforcement community. Detective Martinez's case files revealed a hunt unprecedented in its scope and intensity, fueled by a father's resources and a mother's unshakable faith. Within hours of Luke's disappearance, Michael had mobilized every contact in his vast network. Private investigators were hired, security footage from every camera in a 10-block radius was collected, and a reward that made headlines, $1 million, was offered. The initial search involved hundreds of volunteers, sweeping through Central Park and surrounding neighborhoods with flashlights and hope. The first 48 hours were chaos, Detective Martinez wrote in her report. Anderson had helicopters scanning the city with thermal imaging. Every homeless shelter, every hospital, every possible location was checked and rechecked. I've never seen resources deployed so quickly or extensively. Michael converted his office into a command center. Walls were covered with maps marking possible sightings, timelines, and theories. He hired former FBI agents, retired detectives, even psychics, anything that offered a glimmer of hope. His business empire began to suffer as he devoted more time to the search, but he didn't care. The missing person posters became part of New York's landscape. Michael had them printed on weather-resistant material, ensuring they survived rain and snow. Every time city workers took them down, new ones appeared. The posters evolved as age progression software showed how Luke might look as months turned into years. Sarah's contribution to the search was more personal. She recorded piano pieces, Luke's favorites, which played through speakers mounted on search vehicles. The haunting melodies drifting through city streets became known as Luke's lullaby. And New Yorkers learned to recognize them as a signal that the Andersons were again sweeping the area. The family's driver, James, spent his off hours driving slowly through the city's roughest neighborhoods, showing Luke's picture to anyone who would look. He kept a stack of emergency supplies in his trunk: blankets, food, clean clothes, hoping each day would be the day he found the boy. The hardest part, Michael later confessed, was the false hopes. Every tip, every possible sighting sent us rushing across the city. Each time it wasn't him, something in Sarah would break a little more. Yet they never stopped responding to calls, never stopped hoping the next lead would be real. The Anderson Foundation, originally focused on real estate development, shifted its mission to helping street children. Michael established a network of safe houses and support services, hoping that even if they couldn't find Luke, they might help other lost children find their way home. Their housekeeper, Mrs. Martinez, maintained Luke's room with devoted precision. Every week she would change the sheets, dust the telescope, and replace the water in the vase holding flowers on his desk. "Young Master Luke will want everything fresh when he returns," she would say, her faith matching Sarah's. The search expanded beyond New York. Private investigators followed leads across the country. Michael chartered planes to check promising tips in other cities. Each dead end was marked on the office maps with a red pin, creating a constellation of disappointment that spread across the country. Detective Martinez documented the toll on the family. Mr. Anderson has aged decades in 3 years. Mrs. Anderson maintains her hope, but at great personal cost, yet they continue searching with the same intensity as day one. Their dedication is both inspiring and heartbreaking. The annual ceremonies on the anniversary of Luke's disappearance grew larger each year. The community gathered in Central Park, holding candles, sharing memories, and reminding the city that Luke Anderson was still missing, still loved, still searched for. Sarah would play piano at these gatherings, her music carrying both sorrow and hope across the darkened park. Even when leads dried up, when police suggested scaling back, when well-meaning friends advised them to move on, the Andersons refused to give up. Their love for Luke became a force that transformed their lives, their business, and ultimately their community. Some might see it as obsession. Detective Martinez concluded in her final report before Matthew's arrest, "But I see it as the purest form of love. The Andersons didn't just search for their son, they rebuilt their entire world around the possibility of finding him. In doing so, they helped countless other children and families, creating a legacy of hope from their deepest pain." During Matthew's trial, a different story emerged through his psychiatric evaluation, one that provided context, though not justification, for his actions. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, the court-appointed psychiatrist, uncovered a history of trauma that had twisted into an obsession with social status and revenge. William Matthews hadn't been born into wealth. His childhood in the Bronx had been marked by poverty and shame. His father, a janitor at an elite private school, would bring young William to work, where the boy watched privileged children through windows he was paid to clean. That early exposure to the stark divide between social classes planted seeds of bitterness that would grow into consuming hatred. Patient exhibits deep-seated trauma related to class discrimination, Dr. Hayes noted. His fixation on social status stems from childhood experiences of humiliation and exclusion. The defining moment came when Matthews was 14. His academic excellence earned him a scholarship to the very school where his father worked, but the experience proved traumatic. The wealthy students tormented him relentlessly, hiding his uniforms, mocking his lunch tickets, leaving cruel notes in his father's cleaning cart. The breaking point came during his sophomore year, when classmates staged a fake party invitation similar to what he would later do to Luke. Young William had shown up in his best second-hand clothes, only to find himself the entertainment for his wealthy peers. The parallel between his childhood trauma and his treatment of Luke Anderson is striking, Dr. Hayes wrote. He recreated his own humiliation, but this time cast himself in the role of tormentor rather than victim. It was a perverse attempt at mastery over his past trauma. Matthews had clawed his way into wealth through ruthless determination, building his real estate empire by demolishing low-income neighborhoods, including his own childhood home. Each success hardened him. Each social acceptance came at the cost of his humanity. When Michael Anderson's ethical development plan threatened his project, it triggered all his buried rage. In Anderson, Matthews saw everyone who had ever made him feel inferior, Dr. Hayes explained to the court. The fact that Anderson came from wealth but chose to help the lower classes was, in Matthews' mind, the ultimate betrayal of social order. His revenge wasn't just about business, it was about punishing what he saw as class treachery. Yet the psychiatric evaluation revealed something else: Matthews' profound loneliness. Despite his wealth and social standing, he had no real friends, no family, no connections beyond business transactions. His mansion was as empty as his heart, filled with expensive things but devoid of love or warmth. The ultimate irony, Dr. Hayes concluded, is that in trying to break Luke Anderson's spirit, Matthews confronted the resilience he himself had lost. Luke survived the streets with his humanity intact, while Matthews, for all his wealth, had become the very thing he once despised: a cruel elite using power to hurt the vulnerable. This understanding of Matthews' past didn't diminish his crimes, but it added a layer of tragedy to the story. In his obsessive pursuit of revenge and social status, he had destroyed himself more thoroughly than any external punishment could achieve. As the dust settled from Matthews' arrest, Dr. James Thompson finally shared his own connection to the Anderson saga, a story that revealed how deeply intertwined fate and healing could become. During a quiet evening at the Anderson home, he explained why Luke's case had affected him so personally. 20 years ago, he began, his weathered hands cradling a cup of tea, I had a son about Luke's age. David was brilliant, sensitive, full of the same quiet dignity I recognized in Luke at the party. We lost him to leukemia after a 3-year battle. Sarah squeezed his hand as he continued. But it wasn't just the loss, it was how he faced it that changed me. Thompson had been a different kind of psychiatrist before David's illness, more clinical, less emotionally invested in his patients. Watching his son maintain hope and dignity through grueling treatments transformed his approach to healing. When Sarah Anderson first came to his office, broken by Luke's disappearance, he recognized the same unshakable maternal hope his wife had shown during David's illness. Most of my colleagues thought I was enabling Sarah's denial, he explained. They wanted me to help her accept reality and move on, but I had learned from David that hope, even against impossible odds, can be its own form of healing. Through their sessions, Thompson had collected every detail about Luke, his mannerisms, his way of carrying himself, his inherent kindness. When he spotted the boy at Matthew's party, it was these small details that caught his attention. The way Luke shared water with younger servers, his straight spine despite humiliation, his refusal to let cruelty corrupt his spirit, all echoed Sarah's descriptions. In that moment, Thompson said, his voice thick with emotion, I wasn't just seeing Luke. I was seeing David, the same quiet strength, the same enduring dignity. I couldn't save my son, but I could help save yours. The doctor revealed how he had maintained a careful balance that night, watching Luke long enough to be certain of his identity while discreetly contacting Michael. His years of experience helping trauma survivors had taught him the importance of timing, of choosing the right moment for intervention. When I called Michael, Thompson continued, I knew exactly where he was at his weekly support group for parents of missing children, a group I'd been quietly observing for years. It wasn't just coincidence that he could arrive at the crucial moment. Luke, listening to this revelation, suddenly understood why Thompson had seemed different from the other guests. You were protecting me, he said softly. All those times you diverted attention when things got too intense. Thompson nodded. I couldn't intervene directly without risking Matthews becoming suspicious. but I could create small distractions, moments for you to catch your breath. It was what I wished someone had done for David during his hardest moments." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she realized how this man's personal tragedy had helped preserve her own son's spirit. "You saw him when we couldn't," she whispered. "You recognized our Luke when even he had forgotten who he was." "No," Thompson corrected gently. "Luke never forgot who he was. That's what I recognized, the core of strength and dignity that couldn't be broken, just like David's. Some souls shine brightest in the darkest moments." The connection between the families deepened after this revelation. Thompson's weekly sessions with Sarah transformed into family dinners where healing and hope were shared like bread. David's memory lived on in the gentle way Thompson guided Luke through processing his street experiences, while Luke's survival helped Thompson find purpose in his own loss. The most startling revelation came 6 months after Luke's return, during a routine DNA test ordered by the court for Matthew's trial. The lab technician noticed something extraordinary, a match in the system that would reshape the Anderson family forever. "Mr. Anderson," the police detective called one morning, her voice tense with urgency. "There's something you need to see. When we ran Luke's DNA to strengthen the case against Matthews, we found a familial match. A baby girl was left at St. Mary's Hospital 15 years ago, on the same day Luke was born." Sarah collapsed into a chair as the detective continued. The abandoned baby had been adopted by a family in Boston, the Turners, who had named her Emma. The paperwork had been sealed, but the hospital had maintained DNA records in case the biological family ever came forward. "It's impossible," Michael whispered, but Sarah was already pulling out old photographs. There, in images from the day of Luke's birth, was a glimpse of another bassinet, quickly wheeled away by hospital staff who had told them the second baby hadn't survived. They had been so young, so overwhelmed by new parenthood, they had accepted the explanation without question. The truth emerged through hospital records. A nurse had been part of an illegal adoption ring. She had told the Andersons their second baby was stillborn while arranging her sale to the adoption black market. The Turners, who had adopted Emma, had been completely unaware of her true origins. Luke sat silent through these revelations, suddenly understanding why he had always felt an inexplicable sense of incompleteness. "I used to dream about a girl," he said quietly. "On the streets I would sometimes think I saw her reflection in windows, but when I turned around no one was there." The reunion was arranged carefully, with counselors present for both teenagers. Emma Turner walked into the Anderson home with the same straight spine and quiet dignity that characterized Luke. The twins stood facing each other, mirror images separated by 15 years and 1,000 miles of different lives. "I always knew I was adopted," Emma said, her voice trembling. "But I had these dreams, about a boy who looked like me, who needed my help. I used to wake up crying, but I didn't know why." The Turners, who accompanied Emma, were devastated to learn the truth but showed remarkable grace. They had raised Emma with love, given her every opportunity, made her the accomplished young woman she had become. Now they faced the prospect of sharing her with her biological family. "We don't want to disrupt Emma's life," Sarah assured them, though her heart ached to hold her daughter. "We just want the chance to know her, to help her understand where she comes from." What no one expected was Emma's response to learning about Luke's years on the street. She immediately started organizing fundraisers at her private school in Boston, creating a scholarship program for homeless youth. "My brother survived out there," she would tell potential donors. "Others deserve the same chance he got." The twins developed an intense connection that seemed to transcend their years apart. They could communicate with just a glance, finish each other's sentences, sense when the other was troubled. Luke's nightmares about his time on the streets began to fade as Emma's steady presence helped him heal. "It's like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing," Luke explained to Dr. Thompson. "When I was on the streets, I always felt like someone was watching over me. Now I know it was Emma, even though we were apart." The Andersons and Turners gradually forged a unique extended family arrangement. Emma would spend holidays in New York, while Luke visited Boston. Two sets of parents, one remarkable pair of siblings, all bound together by love that had survived secrets, separation, and years of loss. 1 year after Luke's return, the Anderson family transformed their personal tragedy into a beacon of hope for street children across New York. The Anderson Foundation launched in a converted warehouse in Lower Manhattan, its mission shaped by Luke's experiences and Emma's passionate advocacy. "Every child deserves dignity," Luke declared at the opening ceremony, his voice steady as he addressed a crowd of donors, social workers, and former street kids. Not just food and shelter, but the chance to maintain their spirit, their sense of self-worth. Behind him, the Foundation's motto shone in silver letters, "Hope is not lost." The facility was designed to be everything Luke had needed during his years on the streets. The ground floor housed an emergency shelter with private sleeping pods instead of traditional dormitory beds, giving young people their own space and security. A fully equipped medical clinic occupied one wing, staffed by volunteer doctors who understood trauma and street survival. Emma's influence showed in the education center, where kids could continue their schooling at their own pace. "My brother taught himself math by counting cars," she told the board of directors. "Imagine what these children could achieve with proper support." The classrooms featured flexible schedules and trauma-informed teaching methods, allowing students to learn while healing. Sarah's touch was evident in the arts wing, complete with a music room full of donated instruments. Sometimes, she explained, healing happens through creation rather than conversation. The sound of piano music often drifted through the building, reminiscent of the melodies that had once searched the city for Luke. Michael focused on the practical aspects of rehabilitation. The foundation offered job training, legal aid, and assistance in reconnecting with families when possible. He established partnerships with businesses willing to hire program graduates, creating real pathways out of homelessness. Dr. Thompson served as head of psychological services, implementing a revolutionary approach to trauma care. "We don't just treat the symptoms," he explained. "We help these young people rediscover their inherent worth, their capacity for dignity and resilience." The Foundation's most unique feature was its Youth Advisory Board, comprised entirely of former street children, with Luke serving as chairman. Every decision, from facility rules to program development, had to be approved by those who understood street life firsthand. "This isn't charity," Luke insisted during planning meetings. "It's collaboration. These kids don't need saviors, they need allies, resources, and respect." His experiences shaped every aspect of the Foundation's approach, ensuring that help was offered without humiliation. Within months, the Anderson Foundation became a model for similar programs nationwide. Emma coordinated satellite locations in Boston, while other cities requested guidance in replicating the program. The waiting list for services grew, leading Michael to purchase additional buildings. But perhaps the most powerful aspect was the simple message embedded in the Foundation's existence that tragedy could be transformed into triumph, that dignity could survive the darkest circumstances, and that family could be found in unexpected places. At the end of the first year, Luke stood in the rooftop garden, watching former street kids tending vegetables alongside business executives doing community service. Below, Emma led a fundraising tour, her voice carrying up with the same passion that had once called him home. "We're not just saving lives," he told his parents. "We're preserving souls." William Matthews' transformation began in the unlikeliest of places, a prison therapy group led by Dr. Thompson. After serving 2 years of his sentence, Matthews had reached rock bottom, his empire crumbled, his reputation destroyed. It was there, surrounded by other inmates, that he finally confronted the truth about himself. "I became what I hated most," he admitted during one session, his designer suits replaced by prison orange, his arrogance stripped away by shame. "I spent my life fighting to escape poverty, only to become the kind of monster who torments vulnerable children." Dr. Thompson's approach was uncompromising but compassionate. He made Matthews confront videos from the party, forcing him to watch Luke's dignity in the face of cruelty. Luke Thompson would say, "Look at how this child maintained his humanity while you lost yours." The breakthrough came when Matthews received a letter from Luke. "I forgive you," the boy had written, "not because you deserve it, but because holding on to hatred would make me more like what you were. My years on the street taught me that everyone deserves a chance at redemption." Those words shattered Matthews' remaining defenses. He began writing first journals, then a memoir about his journey from poverty to power, and how the pursuit of status had corrupted his soul. The proceeds were donated entirely to the Anderson Foundation. From his cell, Matthews started organizing financial literacy programs for inmates. He used his business expertise to help former convicts plan for life after release. The man who had once wielded wealth as a weapon began teaching others how to use it responsibly. When the Anderson Foundation launched its prison outreach program, Matthews became an unexpected ally. Through video conferences, he shared his story with street kids, warning them about the price of letting bitterness overshadow humanity. "But I thought wealth would protect me from ever feeling powerless again," he would tell them. "Instead, it turned me into something worse than those who had hurt me. True power isn't in money, it's in maintaining your dignity, like Luke did." 3 years into his sentence, Matthews received an unexpected visitor, Michael Anderson. The meeting was tense but transformative. "I came," Michael explained, "because Luke insisted you were changing. He believes in second chances." Together, they developed a program helping formerly incarcerated individuals find employment in ethical real estate development. Matthews' insider knowledge of predatory practices helped protect vulnerable communities from exploitation. During his parole hearing, Luke surprised everyone by testifying in Matthews' favor. "The man who tormented me at that party was imprisoned by his own hatred," Luke told the board. "The man before you today has found his way back to humanity. Isn't that what rehabilitation should be about?" Matthews was released after serving 5 years. His first act as a free man was to volunteer at the Anderson Foundation's shelter, serving meals to street children. He worked in the kitchen, away from the kids, understanding that some wounds needed distance to heal. "The irony," he confided to Dr. Thompson, "is that I'm finally free. All those years of chasing status, I was building my own prison. It took losing everything to find my way out." Today, Matthews lives modestly, teaching business ethics at a community college and mentoring at-risk youth. His story serves as both a warning about the corrupting influence of power and a testament to the possibility of genuine change. Some people think redemption means erasing the past, he wrote in his final journal entry. But real redemption is about facing it honestly, understanding its lessons, and choosing a different path forward. "Luke Anderson taught me that dignity isn't in what we possess, but in how we treat others." 5 years after Luke's return, the Andersons hosted a remarkable gathering at their home. The living room was filled with an unlikely assembly: the Turner family from Boston, Dr. Thompson, reformed inmates from Matthews' programs, successful graduates from the Anderson Foundation, and even Matthews himself, standing quietly in the corner. The occasion was Luke and Emma's 18th birthday, but it represented something far greater: the healing power of forgiveness and the strength of chosen family. Sarah's piano music filled the air as Luke and Emma greeted guests, their twin connection evident in their synchronized movements and shared smiles. "Look around," Michael addressed the gathering, his arm around Sarah. "Every person in this room represents a different chapter in our story. 5 years ago, we were broken by loss. Today, we're strengthened by how that loss transformed us all." Emma, who had become a fierce advocate for adoption reform and children's rights, stood beside her 2 sets of parents: the Turners who raised her and the Andersons who found her. "Family isn't just about blood," she declared. "It's about choice, about loving people enough to help them heal." Luke, now heading the youth outreach program at the foundation, shared stories of hope. Under his leadership, the program had helped hundreds of street children reconnect with their families or build new support systems. His own experience of maintaining dignity through hardship had become a blueprint for others. Dr. Thompson watched it all with quiet satisfaction, seeing how his own loss of David had led him to help heal so many others. His therapy methods, developed through working with the Andersons, had been adopted by trauma centers nationwide. Matthew's presence was perhaps the most powerful testament to change. He stood respectfully distant, but Luke made a point of including him, showing others that redemption was possible even from the darkest places. "Mr. Matthews," Luke said, addressing him directly, "your story helps our kids understand that it's never too late to choose a different path." The Foundation's graduates shared their successes: college acceptances, new jobs, reunited families. Each story reflected the ripple effect of one family's determination to transform tragedy into hope. The Anderson Foundation had become more than a shelter; it was a model for healing broken systems and broken hearts. Sarah played a special piece she had composed, titled "Coming Home." The melody wove together themes of loss, search and reunion, bringing tears to many eyes. Luke and Emma sat beside her on the piano bench, just as Luke had done as a child, the family's circle finally complete. As the evening drew to a close, Michael raised a toast to hope that never dies, to dignity that survives all trials, and to love that builds bridges across every divide. The gathering represented everything the Andersons had learned through their journey: that healing happens in community, that forgiveness liberates both sides, and that every ending can become a new beginning. Luke looked around at this extraordinary family. They had built birth parents and adoptive parents, reformed adversaries and steadfast allies, all united by a shared belief in second chances and the power of unconditional love. 5 years ago, he reflected, I was alone on the streets, thinking I had lost everything. Today I understand that sometimes we have to lose our way to find a better path, not just for ourselves, but for others who will follow. As guests departed, the future stretched before them, bright with possibility. The Anderson Foundation continued to grow, Emma's advocacy work was changing laws, and Luke's story inspired hope in countless others facing their own dark nights. The piano music drifted into the night, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could become wellsprings of healing, that dignity could survive any trial, and that love, in all its forms, was the most powerful force for transformation. Dear viewers, your thoughts and emotions are the heart of our storytelling journey. If this tale of dignity, redemption, and unconditional love touched your heart, please take a moment to share your reflections in the comments below. Support our team's dedication to bringing you meaningful stories by subscribing to our channel and spreading hope by sharing this video with friends and family. Your likes and engagement inspire us to continue crafting narratives that remind us of humanity's capacity for transformation and healing. Together, let's build a community where powerful stories connect hearts and change lives.